Burlingame can say something that very few people in this room can say. He was born in Washington, D.C. That's right. I attended Phillips Academy at Andover and Princeton University, where he became one of the research assistants for David Herbert Donald, the great scholar. When Donald moved on to Johns Hopkins, Michael followed him, and he eventually got a PhD in history from Johns Hopkins University. In 1968, he joined the history department at Connecticut College in New London. He taught there until he retired in 2001. And most recently, in 2009, he joined the faculty at the University of Illinois at Springfield, where he is the holder of the Chancellor Naomi B. Lynn Distinguished Chair in Lincoln Studies. Is that correct?
It doesn't fit on a business card, but it's
Okay. As probably don't have to tell this group, Professor Burlingame is the author of Abraham Lincoln Life, a 2-volume comprehensive life of the president, and earlier The Inner World of Abraham Lincoln. In addition, he's edited many volumes of Lincoln primary sources, including an oral history of Abraham Lincoln, John G. Nicolay's interviews and essays, Inside Lincoln's White House, The Complete Civil War Diary of John Hay, Lincoln Observed, Civil War Dispatches of Noah Brooks, Lincoln's Journalist, John Hay's Anonymous Writings for the Press. Well, I'm getting a sore throat, so I'm going to stop at that point. There are many more.
Don't, he says.
So without further ado, Dr. Michael Burlingame.
well, thanks for that kind introduction. I relish the opportunity to speak about my favorite subject without having to grade any of your papers or exams. Thank you for inviting me. It's always an honor to be invited to an occasion like this. It's especially an honor to be invited back to a group on an occasion like this. Now, Bruce mentioned the book. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's called Abraham Lincoln, A Life, and here it is. It's 2 volumes, about 2,000 pages. Be sure to buy it. You don't have to read it, but be sure to buy it. I've lived for much of my adult life in New England, and sports writers and sportscasters there regularly refer to something called the Green Monster. You baseball fans doubtless recognize that as an allusion to the left field wall at Fenway Park, but I like to think they're really subliminally plugging my book. A few things that were mentioned in the preliminaries, but first I thought I would like to follow up on. First, about the Grace Bedell letter, which you read. You want to tell a little bit about what you found, Karen, about Grace Bedell?
Oh, wow. Going through Treasury records, I located an 1864 letter from Grace Bedell to President Lincoln asking him to help her find a job in the Treasury Department cutting notes. And so following up on that letter, we ended up going out to Delphos, Kansas, where Grace Bedell settled after the Civil War. And so I walked through her home, and we started the Grace Bedell Foundation to try and save her house. So.
Thank you. Sharon deserves a lot of credit. And it was mentioned that John Ellett has another grandchild.
Yeah,
Two.
Two daughters.
So I don't have grandchildren of my own, but my better half-to-be has 2 little boys. And I'm very fond of them, and they of me. And a while back, when the older one was about 4, he asked, and you'll forgive me, Karen, for telling this story, which I regaled you with earlier today. When he was about 4 years old, he asked his mother about the Lincoln assassination. His mother told him the story, and then her son said, well, Mommy, now, let me get this straight. The president went to the theater at night, and he was watching the play, and in the middle of the play he got shot, but he didn't die till the next morning. And his mother said, well, that's right, son. And he scratched his head and he thought about that, and he said, well, Mommy, at least he got to see the end of the play. I'd like to call your attention to the Abraham Lincoln Institute's March 26th symposium. Be held at Archives 2, and it will feature, among other speakers, Jonathan White, who's written a new book on the Merriman case about Lincoln, and Judge Tawney, based on apparently new material that he discovered, unpublished material. And other fine speakers will be holding forth, so we'll see all of you there. And about visiting the gravesite, as Karen was mentioning, of Thomas Lincoln and his second wife, Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln. Well, I visited that a while back. It's outside Charleston, Illinois, and they have huge tombstones for both of them. And I was quite impressed. And then I noticed a row of little tombstones nearby, and I just idly looked at the names on those, and one of them was Leander Burlingame. Well, it's a fairly unusual name, so I did a little research on him and discovered that he made the coffin that Thomas Lincoln was buried in. Now, some people have said that about my book. That, it's not a very flattering picture of Thomas Lincoln. But, so, in any event. Tonight I'd like to talk about the election of 1860, the centennial of which we're celebrating this year. And one of the questions that historians always ask is, how is it that the Republican Party, which was newborn in 1854, ran its first candidate for president in 1856? That fellow lost the election, and yet Lincoln, 4 years later, is able to win. How was it that the Republicans who were losers in 56 were able to become winners in 1860? And the key swing vote was the know-nothing vote, that is, the American Party vote. In the 1856 election, there were three candidates, a Republican, a Democrat, and a candidate of the American Party, which was a party based on the know-nothing party, which was hostile to immigrants, particularly Catholics, particularly Irish Catholics. And almost 400,000 of them voted for the candidate of the know-nothing party, the American Party. A similar candidacy occurred in 1860. In 1860, as you probably know, there were four candidates, a Republican, two Democrats, and the Constitutional Union Party, which was the heir of the American Party. And the candidate of the Constitutional Union Party won only about a quarter, less than a quarter, of the number of votes that the candidate of the American Party had won back in 1856. So one of the reasons Lincoln won is an awful lot of those folks who had voted in 1856 for the anti-immigrant party switched to the Republican Party. And what accounts for that? How is it that this shift took place? Well, part of the answer is clearly that between 1856 and 1860, the public was much more galvanized about the slavery issue. The Dred Scott decision in 1857 struck people, including Lincoln, as an outrage. How could the Supreme Court rule? And one of the ironies of the Dred Scott decision is that this was the first case in American history in which the Bill of Rights was cited to strike down a federal law. Now, we're familiar with that in 20th century history. Time and again, the rights of us folks as citizens have been defended by the Supreme Court in striking down laws that would inhibit our ability to engage in free speech and political action and the like. But here, the first time it's used, it's to strike down a statute or a Missouri Compromise, a statute forbidding slavery to go into millions of acres in the Old Northwest, and from the Mississippi River out to the Rockies. And so people were enraged at this. You know, people who didn't care much necessarily about the morality of slavery were nonetheless outraged that the pro-slavery Supreme Court, chaired by Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger B. Tawney, would so grossly bend the Constitution into a pretzel and would so grossly misrepresent the intention of the framers and get history wrong. So that helped radicalize people and drive them into the Republican ranks. And then what took place in Kansas in 1857 and 1858, where clearly the people who had moved out to Kansas were against slavery. They didn't want to have slavery in their new constitution. But through a rigged election, a constitution was adopted in Kansas, which was a pro-slavery constitution, and the administration, the Buchanan administration, supported it, even though it was clearly unrepresentative of the majority opinion of the settlers who settled in Kansas. And that enraged a lot of people. Again, people who didn't necessarily care much about the morality of slavery or injustices that were done to black people, but still, that this elementary rule of fair play, that an election should be fair and that it should represent the people who actually lived in the area where the election took place. So those were important in helping to strengthen the Republican cause. But on top of that, and this is what I'd like to argue tonight, the thing that really made Lincoln president, that allowed him to take that coalition that had been established in 1856 and expand it, was his reputation as honest old Abe. That when people went to the polls in 1860 and voted for Lincoln, they were not just voting to say, I'm opposed to slavery or I'm opposed to slavery expansion. They were going to the polls, and by casting their ballots for Abraham Lincoln, they were saying, I'm sick and tired of the corruption that has been carried out by the Democratic administrations of James Buchanan, who was then in office, and his predecessor, Franklin Pierce. So 8 years of Democratic misrule, in which there were all kinds of corrupt activities being carried out on the federal level and on the state level. And so the vote in 1860, which carried Lincoln to the White House, was similar in many ways to the vote in 1976 after Watergate. People went and said, we're not going to vote for Republicans because of the corruption and the shenanigans of the Nixon administration, so we're going to vote for a Democrat. And so Gerald Ford loses, primarily because of the reputation that the party had acquired during Watergate as a party of corruption and untrustworthy. So throw the rascals out. So anyways, the election of 1860 was a similar exercise. Throw the rascals out. These Democrats don't deserve to stay in power. They've abused power, and we can no longer trust them. And we'll vote for Lincoln because he seems like an honest man. He has a reputation for integrity and honesty, and we can count on him to clean the Augean stables in Washington. And Lincoln himself said in a statement that I discovered, I think I've told you this story earlier, about going to Brown University and discovering a series of interviews that had been conducted by John G. Nicolay, Lincoln's principal White House secretary, 10 years after the assassination. And one of his informants was a Pennsylvania congressman who told Nicolay, he said, look, I went out to Springfield between the time that Lincoln was elected and the time he was inaugurated. And I lobbied very hard on behalf of my friend Simon Cameron. I thought Simon Cameron really ought to be in the cabinet. And Lincoln seemed to be resistant to my appeals. And I kept leaning on him and leaning on him. And finally Lincoln said, and at that point, the handwriting of Nicolay, which was nice, clear, cursive script, stops, and you get shorthand. And it was an idiosyncratic form of shorthand, which I couldn't read. And so I went to my friends at the Library of Congress who were familiar with shorthand and asked them, is there anybody here who could read this? And there was a fellow who was transcribing the diaries of Montgomery Meigs. Do you remember his name? Moore, I think it was. Yes. Bill Moore. And he looked at this, he says, well, this looks pretty much like the standard shorthand that was in effect in the mid-1870s, but it's got so many idiosyncratic features that I don't think I could really crack it for you. Well, I was disappointed, needless to say, but then I found a Rosetta Stone. I found a passage in Nicolay's cursive handwriting and then in shorthand where he had translated it. So I gave that to Moore, and he was able to decode these remarks that Lincoln made to this Pennsylvania congressman. And what Lincoln said was, I have just been elected largely on my reputation as honest old Abe. And how can I now, as one of my first official acts as president-elect, appoint to my cabinet a man whose name stinks in the nostrils of the American public for corruption? Kaboom. Tell us what you really think, Abe. Holy mackerel. So, needless to say, I've incorporated that into the Green Monster. So here's Lincoln saying, in his own words, at least as recalled by this Pennsylvania congressman 10 years after the assassination, that I have been elected largely on my reputation as honest old Abe. And Lincoln was in a position to know this, of course. So what I'd like to do is share with you some of the evidence I've adduced for coming to this conclusion that Lincoln was really right, that the issue of corruption in the 1860 election was far more important than most historians have been willing to acknowledge. The slavery issue, to be sure, was important, but you had to take the anti-slavery coalition that had emerged in 1856 and add to it. And what you added to it was a lot of people who were opposed to corruption, and an awful lot of the know-nothings, that is, the voters who had cast their ballots for the American Party back in 1856, were opposed to immigrants, partly because immigrants were regarded as the tools of corrupt city machines. That they went and voted in droves for the Democratic Party because they would then get rewards. They would get jobs, they would get bribes, they would have all kinds of other considerations paid to them for their votes. So the anti-immigrant feeling was partly anti-corruption. The presentation I'm about to make consists of really two parts. First of all, how was it that Lincoln got the nomination? And the corruption issue was very important in that Chicago convention where he won the nomination. And winning the election, how was the corruption issue prominent in the election? And I argue that in both chapters of the 1860s election cycle, in both of those decisions, to nominate Lincoln in the first place and then to elect him as president, the corruption issue was dramatic. Now, in 1859, one of Lincoln's friends, who was a very thoughtful fellow, prophetically called Lincoln the most available, and that means the most electable, presidential candidate for unadulterated Republicans. There's Republicans who really believe that slavery is wrong and must not be allowed to expand. And a year later, that view had become so widespread that Lincoln was able to capture the Republican nomination, and among all the outspoken critics of slavery, he seemed the one most likely to win because he enjoyed a well-deserved reputation as a man of integrity. Helping him immensely at both the Republican nominating convention and in the general election was the widespread desire to punish the Democratic Party for its corruption. During the previous 8 years, Democratic Presidents Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan had tolerated unethical practices which alienated the public. The mood of the country in 1860s was, as I mentioned earlier, akin to that of 1976. Voters wanted to see the rascals thrown out and replace them with ethical men. Now, why does Lincoln, what role does corruption play at the convention in 1860? Well, the front runner, as you all doubtless know, was William Henry Seward. He was a distinguished senator from New York. He had been a governor of New York. He was the foremost spokesman for the Republican Party in the Congress. He had led the fight to halt the expansion of slavery, and he was widely regarded as the true statesman of the Republican Party. And it was widely believed that if the Republicans who gathered in Chicago in May of 1860 to choose a presidential candidate were to show gratitude to the person who had done the most to forward the interests of the party, they would nominate Seward. Seward himself felt that way, you'd be surprised to hear. But the traditional explanation of Seward's failure to win the nomination is that he was too radical. His reputation as an opponent of slavery was too radical. And there's some truth in that. During the debates over the Compromise of 1850, Seward famously declared that there was a law, a higher law than the Constitution, and that it forbade a fugitive slave act, like the one that was passed in 1850. And so this higher law doctrine, there was a law higher than the Constitution, scared a lot of people. That's anarchy, he's talking. Then again, in 1858, he gives a speech in which he says that there's an irrepressible conflict between the North and the South. And people interpreted that wrongly as a declaration of an intent to go to war, that the North and the South were bound to engage in massive bloodshed, and that he was in favor of it. Well, that's a misinterpretation of his words, but that was what was perceived. And in politics, perception is oftentimes more important than reality. So, but in fact, what really doomed Seward's candidacy was something else on top of that. And that is the reputation of his followers, particularly his right-hand man, his alter ego, his political henchman, Thurlow Weed, for corruption. Thurlow Weed was known as the master of the lobby, the master political wire puller and manipulator. And in 1859, the New York legislature had engaged in passing legislation to offer franchises to New York city trolley car operators. And these were sweetheart contracts awarded based on political quid pro quo. We'll give you these contracts if you'll give us money to finance our campaign. That's the way politics was back then. What can I tell you? Back then. And this was widely known. And when the delegates gathered together in Chicago in 1860, they realized that the corruption issue was going to be an important one in 1860, that the public was fed up with the kind of corruption that had taken place under Buchanan and Pierce. But that if they nominated Seward, they would no longer be able to capitalize on the corruption issue because of Seward's association with Weed and the corruption in the New York State legislature. And this was becoming ever more prominent as 1860 wore on. There was a congressional committee known as the Cavode Committee, headed by Congressman Cavode of Pennsylvania. And they issued a big report on all kinds of defalcations and other kinds of corrupt actions by officials in the administration of Buchanan. And that was considered to be the key campaign document in 1860, along with the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Now, by the way, when we think of the Lincoln-Douglas debates and who won them, I think the answer is obvious. Who had them published? The guy who thought he had won, namely Abraham Lincoln. But the Cavode Committee report was considered to be equally important, if not more important, than any documents that dealt with slavery. And so the delegates get out to Chicago and they think, yeah, if we're going to be grateful, we should nominate Seward. If we want to win, we better nominate somebody who is, first and foremost, a bona fide, dedicated opponent of slavery expansion. And second, he has to have a clean record when it comes to corruption. And Lincoln seemed to fit that bill. The other candidates, Seward was the most prominent candidate, but his association with Weed and others in New York lent him, it may be unfair, actually, to blame these corrupt shenanigans in the New York State legislature on Seward, who was in the Senate at that time. But large numbers of people thought once Seward's in, these people are going to be influential in the administration. He owes them favors. He's going to have to give them patronage and other kinds of political favors that will just be the Buchanan administration in a different guise. And the other candidates, Cameron was regarded as corrupt, and he was a favorite son of Pennsylvania. He really didn't have much of a chance for winning the nomination. Another candidate was Edward Bates, and Edward Bates was not regarded as a true opponent of slavery. Edward Bates of Missouri had chaired the 1856 convention in which the Know Nothing American Party nominated its candidate. So he was insufficiently committed to the anti-slavery cause. And Salmon Chase of Ohio was considered too radical on the slavery issue. He wasn't corrupt, but he was considered too radical on the slavery issue. So Lincoln was the obvious choice then if you're going to pick somebody who's got a good reputation for integrity and is also a committed opponent of slavery, but whose commitment to keep slavery from expanding was perceived as reasonable and moderate. And so when the delegates meet, Lincoln has the Illinois delegation sewn up. It's his home state. Then the delegates at the convention in 1860 thought we could win the election if we carried all the states that were carried by Fremont, that is the Republican candidate in 1856, plus Illinois, plus Indiana, and plus Pennsylvania. So the lower north. Those three key states in the north. And Lincoln seemed like he could carry Illinois. Now the question was, could he carry Indiana? And at the Republican convention, it was wide open. There was no series of primaries which had made modern political conventions, in effect, coronations. It was a real convention where decisions were going to be made. They hadn't been predetermined by primary elections. And so one of the things that was critical for the Lincoln people at the Chicago Convention was to get Indiana. And they were able to do that because Lincoln had friends in Indiana. He had practiced law close to Indiana. He had grown up in Indiana from the age of 7 to the age of 21. And so Lincoln and Lincoln's managers, Lincoln was not there, were able to get the Indiana delegation to go along, and so that meant that Lincoln wasn't just a favorite son, like Cameron. He could carry Illinois plus Indiana, and he was able then to get Pennsylvania, and was able then to win the nomination. And if you look at the newspaper reports, and if you look at the correspondence that was shared among delegates, time and again they say, we voted for Lincoln because he was electable and because he was honest. And he had a reputation as honesty, and that was going to enable us to carry the lower north, in addition to what had been carried New England and the upper north in 1856. And there's a great deal of evidence to that effect, which some of which I'll share with you, but not all of it. According to one prominent delegate to the Chicago Convention, who was the anti-slavery champion Joshua Giddings of Ohio, who was the most outspoken opponent of slavery in the U.S. House, said that Seward's operatives disgusted members by their constant assertions that they had the money to win the election and that they could buy up all the doubtful states. And another delegate protested that the New Yorkers were there with money to corrupt, with bullies to intimidate, with whores to seduce. I'm not making this up. On the day before the convention began, on May 15th, it was reported that the Sewardites had plenty of money and were going to use it freely, and that the rumor that money has been freely used to bring about the success of Seward has gravely damaged his prospects. New York operatives would go up to the delegates and say, if you don't nominate Seward, where will you get your money? Vote buying, by the way, was common in those days. Democrats reportedly paid $15 per vote in New Hampshire, and a Republican leader confided that his party carried Delaware in 1861 with purchased votes. A month after the convention, a Boston journalist confided to a friend that I was a Seward man, and am now, but I do not like Governor Seward's Albany friends. I believe them corrupt, and I further believe that it was the fear that the Albany Regency, which was the gang that supported Seward in the New York State Capitol, with weed at its head and some tool of his at its tail, would be the power behind the throne that really defeated Seward. Trust me, there's a lot of other evidence to that effect. It's all entombed there in the Green Monster. Now, as I say, it was perhaps unfair to hold Seward responsible for the corrupt city railroad franchises that were negotiated by Weed, but they tainted the senator in the eyes of many people nonetheless. Some of Seward's backers acknowledged that they, quote, must not blame the people of the United States for being afraid that the election of a leading New York politician to the presidency would only displace the existing corruption at Washington by a new importation of venality and political knavery from Albany. And this is from guys who were supporting Seward at the nomination. They were saying, well, this is what really did our man in. A New York delegate, the former lieutenant governor, a guy named Henry Selden, conceded that all the forces working against Seward would have been insufficient to defeat him, quote, had not his opponents strengthened their arguments by allusion to the corruption practiced at Albany during the past winter. No man entertained the idea that Mr. Seward was connected with them, but it was charged that his friends were, and it was pretended that if elected, the same practice would be transmitted to Washington, and so on and so forth. Several Seward supporters acknowledged the role of the corruption issue. Now, once Lincoln was elected, Joshua Giddings writes to him. Giddings, again, the most prominent anti-slavery member of the U.S. House, writes to him, and he says that the two things really made it possible for you to win. And one was the notion that you were a man of integrity and that Seward wasn't. So, okay, so when Lincoln wins the nomination, then it's on his day. Now, the election campaign. Well, traditionally it's thought that the reason that Lincoln won was just because there was a split in the Democratic Party. The Southern Democrats and the Northern Democrats split. The Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge, the sitting vice president, and the Northern Democrats nominated Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln's old bête noire from Illinois. And that therefore it was inevitable that Lincoln would win. Well, that's, inevitability is a funny thing in politics. It's hard to say anything's truly inevitable. What seems clear is that the corruption issue led an awful lot of people and who said this flat out, that they voted for Lincoln not because they cared about slavery, not because they cared about the race issue at all, but because they cared about corruption. The public was fed up with steamship lobbies, land grant bribery, hireling journalists, the spoils system, rigged political conventions, and cost overruns on government projects. At a New York ratification meeting, Horace Greeley, believe it or not,
Sounds like today.
That's right. Well,
Change those dates.
right. That was in those days. At a New York ratification meeting, Horace Greeley was the most influential newspaper editor at the time. The New York Tribune, and not the New York Times, was the newspaper of record, and Horace Greeley was the editor of the New York Tribune. And so Greeley says at a ratification meeting that there were two irrepressible conflicts, one pitting freedom against aggressive, all-grasping slavery propagandists, and the other, not less vital, was between frugal government and honest administration on the one hand, and wholesale executive corruption and speculative jobbery on the other. The most influential newspaper in New England at the time was the Springfield, Massachusetts Republican, and it accurately prophesied that on an issue likely to rival, if not to overshadow, that of the irrepressible Negro, that of honesty, simplicity, and economy in public affairs, Lincoln would run well, for he is a man of the most incorruptible integrity whose fort is honesty. Honest old Abe will mean something serious as well as prove a taking winning campaign cry. Now, one of Lincoln's advantages in 1860 is that he hadn't been a prominent figure on the national scene for very long. Only in 1858, with his near win over Douglas in the senatorial campaign, did he really become a national figure. So he didn't have a long history and a long resume on the national level for people to look into, as Seward did. And over the years, the more you're exposed, the longer list of votes you've cast and actions that you've undertaken, which can be then held against you. But Lincoln had a relatively short resume. In fact, it's one of the striking features of Lincoln's presidency that his total experience on the national level had been one 2-year term in the House of Representatives from 1847 to 49. Not to be sure, he had run for the Senate in 1855 and lost, and run again in 1858 and lost, and became prominently known, but he only held power for that one brief term in the late 1840s. That helped him. New Englanders stressed the corruption issue especially heavily. The Concord, New Hampshire Statesman newspaper argued that Lincoln's lack of national political experience was an element of strength, for it means that he had not succumbed to the great corruption so prevalent in Washington. The nation is suffering for want of an incorruptible chief magistrate, a man who will indignantly crush out and drive into perpetual exile the inexorable army of bloodsuckers, that's what they said, that hang about the Democratic camp at Washington. This troop is legion and hover over the treasury like Cossacks in the rear of the French army on its retreat from Moscow. A change cannot be for the worse, and it may be for the better. Then let us have a change. Abraham Lincoln is honest, capable, and friendly to the Constitution. Let us put him in as president and drive all the treasury rats away. In Connecticut, where I've lived for many a year, the Hartford Courant declared that one of the strongest arguments in favor of the election of Lincoln to the presidency is his honesty and old-fashioned integrity and firmness. The people all want the government administered with integrity and economy. We have tried 2 dishonest administrations of the Democratic Party. Let us try them no longer, but place the government in the hands of uncorrupted and uncorruptible men. And this appeal, I think, was particularly strong among the people who had supported the American Party in 1856. Now, commentators ascribed Lincoln's victory after the November election to his reputation as honest old Abe. The Republican Congressional Campaign Committee had distributed thousands of copies of a condensed version of the Cavode Committee report on corruption in the Buchanan administration. This is a big, fat government document illustrating and documenting the various misdeeds of the Buchanan administration. clearly many voters shared Indiana Congressman David Kilgore's desire, quote, to see that this godforsaken, hell-deserving set of corrupt politicians is turned out of office and honest men get put in their places. The Missouri Democrat, a newspaper in St. Louis, was sure that the deep and just hatred of the corrupt and reckless national democracy in those days referred with a capital D to the Democratic Party, would carry Lincoln to victory and stay the waves of the deluge of corruption. On election eve, the New York World, and the New York World at that time was a Republican paper, went on to become the leading paper, anti-Lincoln paper in the Civil War, but at the time it was a Republican paper. It remarked that thousands of intelligent men support the candidates of the Republican Party, not that they care a broken tobacco pipe for the Negro question, but because they see no other way to honest management at Washington. They believe that the Democratic Party has been so long in power that it has become corrupt and that it understands too well the crooked arts by which partisan pockets are lined at the public expense, and that it is safer to try and experiment with new men and a young party than to continue a set of old party hacks at the public crib. If Mr. Lincoln's administration shall prove honest, economical, and tranquilizing, that's what it says, they will be quite satisfied, though he should never once allude to free soil in any of his annual messages, and so on. A Republican senator from Iowa, James W. Grimes, said, "Our triumph was achieved more because of Lincoln's reputed honesty and the known corruption of the Democrats than because of the Negro question." Grimes' colleague in the U.S. Senate, Lyman Trumbull. Lyman Trumbull was a senator from Illinois who had won his Senate battle when Lincoln was actually aspiring to the Senate. And Lincoln, that's a complicated story, but Lincoln basically threw his support to Trumbull, even though Trumbull had started off at a very low level of support, and beat Lincoln out for the Senate. Lyman Trumbull shared that view. He argued that the country has become disgusted with the profligacy, plunder, and stealing here in Washington in the departments of government. Mr. Lincoln owes his election in a great degree to a desire for reform in these respects. And it wasn't just Republicans who were saying this. Democrats were acknowledging that too. The head of the Democratic Party was a rich guy named August Belmont. He echoed these Republican leaders. He said the country at large has become disgusted with the misrule of Mr. Buchanan and the corruption which disgraced his administration. The Democratic Party was made answerable for his misdeeds, and a change was ardently desired by thousands of conservative men out of politics. This feeling was particularly strong in the rural district and did us infinitely grave harm there. A New Englander, a fellow from Connecticut, wrote to a Kentucky senator and said that multitudes of us in New England voted the Republican ticket because we wanted honesty to replace corruption. And a case in point was the economist David A. Wells, who said, "I voted for Mr. Lincoln not because I hated slavery or thought it a sin or wished in any way to do my neighbor a wrong, but because I was disgusted with the present administration and wished for a change." In Rhode Island, another New England state, a Democratic literary luminary insisted that the Republican success, quote, is not owing to anti-slavery. It is owing to the failure of the Democratic federal administration, a failure caused by corruption and one-sidedness and an ultra-pro-slavery policy. Now that shouldn't be left out of the equation. The fact that the Buchanan administration did support the Lecompton Constitution helped radicalize Northerners. But the corruption issue also has to be taken very seriously into account. Horace Greeley, who doubted that many Northerners hated slavery on moral grounds, thought that they desired above all things a radical reform in the patronage and expenditures of the government. Well, there are plenty of newspaper commentators and others who make this point. And I'd like to just close with a quote from one of Lincoln's primary supporters at the Republican National Convention in 1860, Joseph Medill. Joseph Medill was an editor of a very influential newspaper, the most important newspaper in the West for the Republican Party, namely the Chicago Tribune. And Joseph Medill said that we got Lincoln nominated on the idea of his honesty and elected him by endorsing him as Honest Abe. So both the nomination and the election. Now, one of the ironies of the nomination, of course, is that Lincoln was nominated not just because of his reputation as Honest Old Abe, not just because of his electability, but because of deals that were cut in the Chicago Convention, which smacked of political corruption. Well, if not corruption, at least bargaining. Now, the two biggest mistakes Lincoln made in appointing his cabinet were to name Simon Cameron as his Secretary of War, whose name stank in the nostrils of the American public for corruption, and Caleb B. Smith as Secretary of the Interior. And those two guys were placed in the cabinet largely because of promises that had been made by Lincoln's campaign managers at Chicago without Lincoln's authorization. I mean, Lincoln writes to David Davis, who was his chief campaign manager at Chicago, and he sends him a message. It was hand-delivered by the editor of the Springfield Republican newspaper, saying, I will be bound by no bargains, make no bargains in my name. And David Davis gets this, and he said, Lincoln ain't here. He doesn't know the kind of pressures we're dealing with. And so, there's been some controversy among historians about was there an actual quid pro quo? What was the Indiana delegation promised? If you vote for Lincoln on the first ballot, we will name Caleb B. Smith. I'll make sure that Caleb B. Smith is put in the cabinet. And on the second ballot, if Kent, Pennsylvania goes for Lincoln on the second ballot, Simon Cameron will be put in the cabinet. Well, there's a lot of conflicting evidence on both sides. But it seems that at the very least, Lincoln's managers, without his consent, promised that Indiana would get a cabinet position. Doesn't necessarily mean Caleb Smith would be the guy to get it, but that Indiana was promised a cabinet position and that Pennsylvania was promised a cabinet position. And not necessarily that Cameron would get it, but as I say, the evidence for this is somewhat contradictory. But it seems to me at the very least that the evidence is strong enough to say that promises were made that at least a cabinet member would come from Indiana and another cabinet member would come from Pennsylvania. And so Lincoln was somewhat constrained as he chose his cabinet by these understandings that had been reached without his authorization at Chicago. And he felt bound to carry them out, even though he himself would not have authorized them if he had been there on the scene. And in those days, it was considered unseemly for a candidate to actually go to the convention where he was nominated. Seward, for example, didn't go to Chicago. He stayed in his home in Auburn, New York, surrounded by lots of champagne bottles, which were going to be opened as soon as the news came in that he had won the nomination. He was pretty sure he was going to win. And Seward, of course, was extremely disappointed that he was passed over by Lincoln, and he didn't campaign very enthusiastically for Lincoln in 1860. And when Seward became Secretary of State designated, and I'm a great admirer, by the way, of Doris Kearns Goodwin and her book, A Team of Rivals. But the notion that this was somehow an innovation on Lincoln's part to name his rivals to positions of authority in his cabinet was not Lincoln's invention. That was a fairly traditional that you would. These days, you take your vice president is the guy that was the first closest challenger. In those days, it was often Secretary of State. So Seward was the most obvious challenger, and he becomes Secretary of State. Not in those days, that was considered a stepping stone to the White House. I was doing my doctoral dissertation research a while back, toward the latter part of the Second Punic War, and I was doing a guy named Carl Schurz. Carl Schurz is a German American who was based in Wisconsin, who was a big Seward supporter at the nomination convention in Chicago, and then a big Lincoln champion during the campaign. And Schurz was a hopeless egomaniac. And his daughter published his letters, but she didn't always accurately transcribe them. This guy was such an egomaniac. He would write to his wife about how he had gone out and given a speech in 1860 for Lincoln. And he writes to his wife, and if you look at the original letter at the Library of Congress in German old-fashioned German handwriting, which is sort of halfway between Roman chirography and Cyrillic, he says, Ich sprach mit dem alten, ich sprach wie ein junger Gott. I spoke like a young guy. and then you see the printed version. Ich habe wie ein Younger, ich habe mit dem alten Feuer gesprochen. I spoke with the old fire. So this guy's a hopeless egomaniac. And having helped Lincoln win the election, he said, I deserve my reward, and I want a first-class diplomatic appointment to Europe. And Seward says, no. Seward didn't want to appoint Shorts to a position of authority in the diplomatic corps to a major European capital because he was a revolutionary. He had helped champion the German Revolution of 1848, which had failed. He had fled to this country. And the European countries at this time were under pretty conservative rule in most cases. So Seward said no, but we'll give you a good appointment in South America. And Short says no. And so he sends his congressman. He lives out in Wisconsin, so this congressman guy, whose name eludes me at the moment, goes in and says to Seward, if you don't appoint Carl Schurz to be an important ambassador in Europe, the German voters of this country will be very disappointed. Seward stands up, looks at this guy, Congressman Potter, John F. Potter, and he says, disappointed? How dare you speak to me of disappointment? I have been passed over by this little lawyer from Illinois when I was the founder of the Republican Party and its chief spokesman. Don't you dare talk to me about this. There was some sense of what Seward was like. And it's much to Seward's credit, though, that he thought that he was going to be the premier. That Lincoln would cut the ribbons for bridge openings and highway openings and kiss babies and all that, but Seward would really be the power behind the throne. And when Lincoln asserted himself and said to Seward, now the general public may have made a mistake in electing me rather than you, but they did elect me, so I'm going to make the decisions, and I hope you'll support them, and I really want your advice and your counsel and your support. And Seward, in June of 1861, just a few months after the inauguration of Lincoln, writes back to his wife saying that executive skill and power are rare qualities and the president's the best of us all. So Seward learned pretty early on and became a very close friend of Lincoln's and cooperated with him very closely in managing foreign affairs and in other areas. Salmon Chase, on the other hand, the Secretary of the Treasury, thought that he was Lincoln's superior. He had been governor of Ohio, he had been senator from Ohio, and so he considered this hick lawyer from Illinois to be infinitely his inferior. But Seward never did get, Chase never did get the message that Seward conveyed to his wife. And Chase kept thinking that he was superior to Lincoln and tried to steal the nomination from Lincoln in 1864, and Lincoln very gently but firmly put him in his place. And it's one of Lincoln's great strengths that he was able to put up with the backbiting and shenanigans that Chase carried on. People would come to Lincoln and say, Chase is undermining your candidacy. He's bad-mouthing you. He's cultivating everybody that you've had to disappoint and trying to get them to line up support for his nomination for president in 1864 to replace you. And Lincoln would say, that's okay. As long as he does his job at the Treasury Department, does a good job, I'm not going to pay any attention to that. It's a little bit like a horsefly on a horse. It bites him and it keeps him working. So his ambition is just like that horsefly. So the larger point I wish to reiterate again is that we think of the 1860 election, think of Lincoln's triumph not just as a triumph of anti-slavery principles, but a triumph of integrity over corruption. So I thank you for your attention. There was no question about the constitutionality of the emancipation once the 13th Amendment is passed in January 65 and ratified in December 65. The second thing that Lincoln was concerned about, as you mentioned, was greenbacks, whether the law establishing a legal tender paper money during the Civil War would be legal. Chase had introduced this innovation, and it was assumed that he would therefore naturally vote to uphold its constitutionality. But he didn't, as we suggest, he voted against it on constitutional grounds. So the two reasons that led to Chase being appointed, at least the two practical reasons of immediate Supreme Court jurisdiction, turned out to be irrelevant. On the other hand, Chase was widely regarded as the spokesman for the radical wing of the Republican Party. And that was justified. And Lincoln felt that it was important to keep the radicals happy. Lincoln's greatest challenge throughout the Civil War was keeping the Republican Party united. How do you get the radicals and the moderates and the conservatives to pull together? And that was no easy chore, because you've got slaveholders in Kentucky, and Missouri and Delaware and Maryland, and abolitionists in Vermont and Massachusetts and Maine. How do you keep those guys working in tandem? You've got former Whigs and former Democrats who hated each other with the kind of passion that I've seen in where I've lived in halfway between New York and Boston, between Yankees fans and Red Sox fans. I mean, they're never going to work together. You've got free traders who believe that tariffs are a terrible idea, and you've got protectionists who insist on tariffs. How do you keep those people united? You've got beer-swilling Germans throughout the Midwest, and you've got teetotalers from New England. And how do you keep those, the wets and the dries, working together? And so a careful distribution of patronage on all levels, the cabinet level, sub-cabinet level, state level, generalships, all that has to be taken into account. So Lincoln, in order to please the radical wing of the party, names Chase. But he says to two different friends of his, if my own personal wishes were consulted, I would rather swallow hot andirons, or I would rather eat the chair that I'm sitting in, rather than to appoint Chase. But he's an important leader of the party in the radical wing, and therefore he has to be appointed. So it's one of the most striking features of Lincoln's character is his almost superhuman magnanimity, his willingness to overlook insult, disagreement, criticism. And the two most dramatic examples of that are Chase being appointed to the Supreme Court and Edwin Stanton being appointed to be Secretary of War. Cameron turned out to be, as everybody could have anticipated, a disastrous Secretary of War. And so that is arguably Lincoln's worst appointment. But then arguably Lincoln's best appointment was his successor, Edwin Stanton, appointed in January '62 to replace Cameron. And Stanton had, as you all probably know, insulted and treated Lincoln with abject contempt 7 years earlier, in a trial where they were both arguing, they're both members of the same team arguing a very important patent case in Cincinnati. And Stanton just treated Lincoln, Stanton was a very sophisticated patent lawyer from the East, and he treated Lincoln as a hopeless bumpkin and insulted him to his face, treated him with contempt. And yet, when it comes time to appoint a Secretary of War to replace Cameron, he knows he's got to appoint somebody from Pennsylvania. Cameron was from Pennsylvania. Stanton's from Pennsylvania. He has to be a former Democrat because you have to have an equal number of former Whigs and former Democrats in the cabinet, or at least altogether in cabinet meetings. And has to be somebody who's capable and competent. And the only guy around who seemed to fit all three of those criteria was Stanton. So he just overlooked the insults to which he had been subjected back in 1855 and appointed Stanton. It's a remarkable story.
Another question? Any other question?
You just answered my question earlier. My question was, in reading Team of Rivals, when he was picking his cabinet, why it was so important that there be one from New York, one from Ohio, one from Pennsylvania. He was really trying to keep everybody.
Right. But when you made a cabinet back in those days, you had to take into account ideological balance and geographical balance.
I was just amazed at
Lincoln once said that probably back when Jesus probably had to deal with us and appointed the 12 apostles.
Any other questions?
Yes, Jeff?
Yes, sir.
What about today's Tea Party? Is any relationship to that party, the 1860, you think?
The Tea Party and the Republican? Well, I think so, yes. So there's a sense that things have gotten out of hand in Washington, and there's a kind of grassroots rebellion against it. And insofar as the Tea Party represents that kind of upsurge of popular discontent, it may be not so much a corruption, but a sense that there's too much spending, that the government has gotten too powerful, that too many decisions are being made beyond the real wishes of the public in general. I think that there's a strong parallel.
Another question here. Yes.
Yes, in writing your, as you described it, the Green Monster, what is the most fascinating piece of information that you discovered or found about
Well,
Lincoln?
I think I probably have shared this with you last year, but let me reiterate it. It was those two speeches in the Frederick Douglass papers. Did I talk about those when I was here last time? Where he says Lincoln was emphatically the black man's president, and where he said that every group of Americans has a right to bemoan the death of Lincoln, but no group has a greater justification than the colored people, for whom the death of Lincoln is an unspeakable calamity. And so I think I may have mentioned last time I was here, almost everybody who writes about Lincoln and race talks about a speech that Frederick Douglass gave in 1876, where he said Abraham Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president. We black folks were only his stepchildren. And here's this speech: Abraham Lincoln was emphatically the black man's president. As I think I may have mentioned, I wrote to the people at Yale who had published the 5 volumes of Frederick Douglass speeches, and asked them, "Why did you omit this fantastic speech?" Sorry, they didn't write back, and then I called them and they didn't respond. As I said, those of us who went to Princeton aren't surprised Yale was fashion. What can I tell you?
Greg, I think you had a question.
Since Lincoln didn't have much of a political career before 1860, how in the world did he get the reputation, above all others, of honest aid? When did that whole process begin?
It's partly because of his reputation going back to the days when he was in New Salem as a young man. And so he was a merchant for a while, not a very successful one, but he was famous for giving honest weight, and if he overcharged somebody, he would walk 10 miles down a dirt road to give her back the 6 cents or whatever she had been overcharged. And that in his dealings with Douglas, for example, in the 1858 campaign, Lincoln is always bending over backwards to give his opponent the benefit of the doubt, to concede some merit in the case of the opponent. But he's also insistent that his party's, whereas Douglas engages in just the most outrageous, shameless demagoguery. And so people have often asked me, do you think Lincoln could have succeeded if he'd been president today, given the fact that he had a relatively high, squeaky voice and that he was relatively physically unattractive? And I say, yeah, because I think that Lincoln radiated a quality of integrity. It wasn't necessarily anything he'd done or what he said, although those were important. It was what he, as a person, stood for and radiated. And it wasn't the product of spin doctors or political consultants. It was what he was. And I think that comes across pretty strongly. And that over the years, he had acquired this reputation, and particularly in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, had ratified it. But it's a good question.
Last question for this evening. Anyone have a question? Well,
Wait a minute.
sorry, you have
How did Herndon contribute to that reputation?
Well, Herndon's reputation has been, I think, grossly underestimated. That William Herndon really deserves an awful lot of credit, and all of us who care about Lincoln should be extremely grateful to William Herndon, because Herndon conducted what could be considered the first oral history project. That is, he went out and interviewed dozens, scores of people, and corresponded with more who had known Lincoln, both before the presidency and during the presidency. And he compiled this tremendous archive of material, which sheds a great deal of light on Lincoln, particularly in the pre-presidential years. And a lot of what we know about Lincoln was what he was like in New Salem is because of these interviews that Herndon conducted. And when I was a youngster, and David Herbert Donald was my mentor, David had written his doctoral dissertation on Herndon. And David's mentor was James G. Randall. And James G. Randall was married to Mrs. Randall. and she was a Mary Lincoln partisan. So she wrote this book, or she wrote an essay called "Sifting the Anne Rutledge Evidence." This was an attempt to discredit the notion that Abraham Lincoln, as a young man in New Salem, had fallen in love with Anne Rutledge, which Herndon had stipulated in a lecture that he'd given shortly after Lincoln's death, which upset Mrs. Lincoln a lot, which is not surprising. So Mrs. Randall wanted to prove that the only woman that Lincoln ever really loved was Mary Todd. And to do that, you had to discredit the story of Anne Rutledge. Now, 24 people write to Herndon or speak to him and tell him, Lincoln was in love with Anne Rutledge. They were engaged to be married. She died. He was heartbroken. He was inconsolable. And she wanted to prove that all that was nonsense. So she wrote this essay called "Sifting the Anne Rutledge Evidence," in which she argued that all the testimony that dealt with Anne Rutledge and Lincoln and their romance was given by these old codgers who were doddering around and drooling on their walkers and making up stories out of whole cloth. And so she writes this. Then he takes, her husband, James G. Randall, then takes that essay and he inserts it in a most peculiar place as an appendix to volume 2 of his 4-volume study of Lincoln the President. What does that have anything to do with Lincoln the President? No, it's Lincoln in his Salem 20 years earlier. And he doesn't tell you that his wife wrote it. Because he had great credibility as a Lincoln scholar, the 4-volume. They were relatively short volumes. Burris's books, by the way. Burris has written two books recently that are really very fine, except they're too short.
I'm very lazy on
Yes, merciless editors. But anyway, he had great credibility as a Lincoln scholar. So when this essay appears, or this appendix appears, Sifting the Anne Rutledge Evidence, everybody thinks that it's by James G. Randall, and therefore they give it great credence. Now, and the argument that is made in that piece by Mrs. Randall, Sifting the Anne Rutledge Evidence, is not only is the Anne Rutledge story not credible, but in addition, the Herndon archive should be treated as untrustworthy. And so for 50 years, this book appeared in 1945, for 50 years, people shied away from the Herndon archives. They said, oh, well, those people who were talking to Herndon can't be trusted. Their reminiscences are not trustworthy, they're not reliable. They're these old-timers talking about things that happened 34 years earlier. And I'm going to say, when I began my first book, The Inner World of Abraham Lincoln, that came out in '94, I was trained by David Dunn, so this is what I assumed was the case with the Herndon archive, but I thought I really should look at it. It hadn't been published then, or it had been published in a very poor edition, just fragments of it. And so I looked at it on microfilm, which was a challenge. It's a very early microfilming job, very poor quality microfilm, and pretty tough handwriting to read. And I assumed that this was all, I should look at this just to say I've looked at it, but I didn't think I would really get anything out of it. And as I turned the crank and looked at frame after frame, I thought, this stuff seems pretty good to me. These guys don't seem to be making up stuff. And whenever Herndon runs into contradictory evidence, he goes and he talks like a good lawyer to both sides and tries to reconcile the discrepancies. And so I thought, well, and so I decided I'm going to use this stuff. And so I thought I'm going to get crucified by the reviewers. But I believed it was true. Well, luckily, just before my book came out, two very fine historians out in Illinois, John Y. Simon and Douglas L. Wilson, published articles about the Anne Rutledge story, arguing that the story was true and that the Herndon archive was a far more trustworthy source than people had heretofore regarded it. And so in a way, and then Douglas Wilson and his colleague Rodney Davis out at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, published a big fat. My books are magisterial. Their book is fat. Called Herndon's Informants, which is beautifully indexed and carefully annotated and done, so that Lincoln scholarship has, particularly for the pre-presidential period, has benefited immensely from what Herndon's done, and it tends to confirm this reputation of Lincoln as honest old man. Well, again, I thank you all for your attention.